Welcome to Policy Precision, an unbiased dive into executive orders. I'm Ethan Caldwell.
And I'm Nora Harper.
Okay, let's get straight to it. We're diving into Executive Order 14163 today. The official title is Realigning the United States Refugee Admissions Program.
Right. And this one was signed on January 20th, 2025 by President Trump. It popped up in the Federal Register about 10 days later, January 30th.
So our sources for this deep dive are pretty straightforward. The official text itself from the Federal Register and also Wikisource, plus some context from the White House site.
Yeah. And our mission here really is to unpack it. What's its core purpose? What are the big policy changes? And, what might the effects be down the line?
Exactly. So Section 1 kicks things off by stating the purpose. It talks about, quote, record levels of migration in the 4 years before the order.
And it specifically includes migration through the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program, the USRAP.
It does, and it mentions specific places facing challenges.
Oh, yeah. That part caught my eye, too. It wasn't just like the usual big cities, though New York, Chicago, Denver are in there, but also places like Charleroi in Pennsylvania, Springfield, Ohio, Whitewater, Wisconsin. Kind of showing a broad scope.
Right, suggesting this wasn't just an urban issue. It mentions some places like New York and Massachusetts even declared states of emergency.
So the order is painting this picture of widespread strain.
Pretty much. And the argument boiling down to the U.S. Lacked the capacity at that point to absorb large numbers of migrants and refugees.
Without, according to the order, compromising resources for Americans, safety, security.
And the, quote, appropriate assimilation of refugees. That's a key phrase.
It really is.
Yeah.
And because of all that, the immediate step in Section 1 is pretty stark.
Yeah, suspension of the USRAP.
Just paused. Halted, really.
Until, as it
Right.
says, entry aligns with U.S. interests again. So it's not necessarily permanent, but definitely indefinite.
Okay, so that's the why. Section 2 then gets into the actual policy directives. Right. Two main things here. First, public safety and national security have to be the top priority in running the USRP whenever it might resume.
Paramount considerations is the wording.
Exactly. And second, tying back to that capacity point, it says the U.S. should only admit refugees who can, quote, fully and appropriately assimilate, plus preserving taxpayer resources for citizens.
That phrase again, fully and appropriately assimilate, it's quite subjective, isn't it? The order doesn't actually define what that looks like.
No, it doesn't.
Yeah.
Which, leaves a lot of room for interpretation on how that would be measured or judged.
Definitely. And there's a secondary goal in Section 2 as well about involving states and local areas more.
Ah, yes, giving them a role, it says, in deciding where refugees are placed or settled. But with a caveat.
A big one. To the extent permitted by law and as practicable. So it's an aim, but maybe not a guaranteed shift in power.
Seems like it. Okay, so Section 3 gets into the nuts and bolts of the suspension itself, the actual realignment.
Right. This is where the legal authority comes in. It cites the Immigration and Nationality Act, sections 212 and 215.
Which basically give the president power to restrict entry if it's seen as detrimental to the country's interests.
And that's exactly what the order does. It proclaims that letting refugees in under the USRIP would be detrimental.
And bam, effective January 27th, 2025, 12:01 a.m. EST, entry under USRIP is suspended.
It also tells the Secretary of Homeland Security to stop making decisions on pending refugee applications, so it affects people already in the pipeline.
But there is that exception, subsection C. It's not a total freeze.
Explain that bit.
Well, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Homeland Security, acting together, can still decide to let individual refugees in.
Okay.
But only if they both agree it's in the national interest and the person doesn't pose a security or welfare threat. So case by case, a sort of safety valve, maybe?
Seems like it. And then subsection D loops back to that state and local involvement idea.
Right. It tasks the Secretary of Homeland Security, along with the Attorney General, to look into existing laws.
To find ways to give states and localities more, say, in placement and resettlement.
Yeah, but again, with constraints. It has to comply with existing laws, and importantly, it still has to follow the existing rules about consulting with states and local governments. That's in 8 U.S.C. 1522A2 for any refugees admitted under that exception we just talked about.
Got it. So it's exploring options, but within the current legal framework.
Seems that way. Okay, so Section 4. What happens next? How does the program potentially get restarted?
Reporting requirements. The Secretary of Homeland Security, consulting with the Secretary of State, has to report to the president within 90 days.
And that report has to say whether restarting USRAP entry is in the national interest, right?
Hmm.
Considering those policies from Section 2.
Exactly. Safety, security, assimilation, and those factors.
And it's not just a one-off report, is it?
No, it says every 90 days after that first one. Continuous assessment.
And crucially, the suspension stays in place until the president actually determines that resuming the program is in the national interest.
So the default is suspension, pending these reviews and a presidential green light.
Okay. Section 5's pretty straightforward. Revocation.
Yeah, it just flat out revokes Executive Order 14013 from February 2021.
Which was, if I remember correctly, focused on rebuilding the refugee program after previous cuts, and it also talked about climate change and migration.
That's right. So canceling that previous order sends a pretty clear signal about the change in direction.
Definitely a policy shift. And then the last bits, Section 6 and 7.
Standard stuff, mostly. Section 6 is severability. You know, if one part is struck down by a court, the rest hopefully stays intact.
And Section 7 is general provisions. Things like, this order doesn't mess with agencies' existing legal powers. It depends on Congress actually funding things.
And importantly, it clarifies that this order doesn't create any new legal rights that someone could sue the government over.
Right. No private right of action, as they say.
So wrapping it all up, what's the big picture here? Executive Order 143-163 is essentially hitting pause on the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program.
Yeah, a temporary suspension, technically, while reviews happen. And the justifications given are all about capacity, resources for Americans, national security, and this idea of assimilation.
The key policy changes are really that heightened focus on national security and assimilation criteria.
And that stated goal, however qualified, of giving states and localities more input on where refugees end up. How that plays out remains to be seen, pending those reports.
It definitely sets up a different framework for considering refugee admissions.
For sure. So thinking about everything laid out in this order, the local impacts mentioned, the national security concerns, the resource questions, assimilation, humanitarian aspects,
Yeah.
it pulls in a lot of complex threads.
It really does. Which leads to the final thought for you, our listener. Considering all these factors outlined in the order, what do you think are the most crucial elements to weigh when deciding the future path for the U.S. Refugee Admissions Program?